My name is Isabella, and I'm 28 years old. Like many women my age, I have a job, a family, and a husband, Richard, who is 2 years older than me. We've been married for almost a year, but it hasn't been the smooth journey I once dreamed of. Let me take you back to where it all began. Richard and I met at a party. I was invited by a colleague and honestly wasn't expecting much. It was one of those events where everyone is loud, confident, and trying to impress. Richard was different, though. Amidst all the noise, he stood out as calm, quiet, and incredibly kind. He wasn't like the other men who tried too hard or came off as sleazy. His conversations were thoughtful and genuine. I remember him telling me, "My family is really close. We spend a lot of time together." He didn't have to boast about his accomplishments like everyone else. He was just real. I gave him my number, and from that moment, we started seeing each other more often. We clicked almost instantly. Richard had lived with his parents up until that point, while I had been living alone since college. Because he didn't pay rent, his finances were in better shape than mine, and he loved to travel, something I couldn't afford as often as he could. Despite our differences, we enjoyed spending time together, and soon we started dating seriously. Before I knew it, we were engaged and planning a life together. Everything seemed perfect. We got married, and I thought this was it, my happily ever after. But as soon as we moved into our apartment, things changed. Richard was thrilled about moving out of his parents' home and starting fresh in our new place. I was too, but there was one thing I hadn't expected. His parents were never far behind. One night, just a few weeks into our marriage, Richard casually said, "Hey, I'm inviting Mom and Dad over this weekend." I thought it was a sweet gesture. After all, it's normal for family to visit. But then he added, "Actually, they'll be coming over every weekend from now on." Every weekend? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to stay calm, assuming it was a temporary thing, but it quickly became clear that this was our new reality. Richard's parents lived only a short drive away, and they took full advantage of that fact. They would arrive Friday night and stay until late Sunday, every single weekend. At first, I tried to make the best of it. Family is important, right? But after a while, the constant visits started to wear me down. The conversations were always the same. "Oh, Richard is such a wonderful son," his mother would say, beaming with pride. "He's the pride of the family." They would go on and on, praising him for hours while I sat there, forced to smile and nod, but never feeling included in the conversation. Hosting my in-laws every weekend meant I had to cook elaborate meals, clean the house, and entertain them. My weekends, which I once used to relax, became exhausting. I had no time to unwind because I was always playing the perfect daughter-in-law. And no matter how hard I tried, nothing seemed to be good enough. My mother-in-law, Emma, would always have something to criticize. "Isabella, your cooking is a little bland, isn't it?" she'd say, looking over at Richard. "Are you eating properly? You look thinner." Richard never defended me. Instead, he would smile awkwardly and say, "I eat out during the week, Mom. Don't worry." But it was clear from the way his family talked that they didn't appreciate my cooking. They liked their food heavily seasoned, while I preferred something more subtle. To keep the peace, I started adding more salt to my meals, but even then, it was never enough. "Oh, this is a little better," they'd say, but I could tell they still weren't satisfied. I was doing everything I could to make them happy, but it was never enough. And then things got worse. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find my mother-in-law in my kitchen. It was almost 9 p.m., and there she was, standing at the stove, her hands moving swiftly as she chopped vegetables. "I'm here to teach you how to cook," she said, smiling as if she was doing me a huge favor. I was exhausted and just wanted to go to bed, but instead, I found myself standing in the kitchen, watching as she made a meal that was far too heavy and over-seasoned for my taste. This wasn't a one-time thing either. Emma started coming over more frequently, always with the excuse of helping me cook. She'd show up on weeknights, despite knowing I had to wake up early for work the next day, It felt like I had no control over my own home anymore. One weekend, after another long visit from my in-laws, I suggested to Richard that we take a trip together, just the two of us. I thought it would be a great way for us to reconnect and spend some time away from his parents. Richard loved the idea and eagerly started planning. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. But that hope quickly turned to despair. On the day of the trip, we arrived at the bus station, bags packed, ready for a weekend getaway. I was excited, thinking it would be just the two of us. But as we waited for the bus, I noticed Richard looking around nervously. "What's wrong?" I asked. But before he could answer, I saw them, his parents. They were walking toward us, waving. "Oh, good. We made it in time," his mother said, out of breath from rushing. "Sorry to keep you waiting, Richard." My heart sank. Richard smiled sheepishly. "Mom and Dad thought it'd be more fun if we all went together," he explained. I was crushed. This trip was supposed to be for us, a chance to get away from the constant presence of his parents. But now they were coming along, and my hopes of a peaceful weekend were gone. The trip was miserable. Richard catered to his parents' every whim, ignoring my preferences. I felt like a third wheel on my own vacation. To make matters worse, the room we were staying in wasn't a cozy suite for two like I had hoped. It was a large, 4-person room, with beds for all of us. Their loud snoring kept me up all night, and by the time we returned home, I was more exhausted than when we left. Back at work, a colleague pointed out something that sent a chill down my spine. "Isabella, you've got a bald spot," she said, pointing to the back of my head. I rushed to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, horrified to find a small coin-sized patch where my hair had fallen out. The stress of dealing with Richard's parents had started to take a physical toll on me. That night, I confronted Richard. I told him we needed to do something about the constant visits from his parents. He seemed sympathetic at first, but when I suggested inviting my own parents along for our next trip, he recoiled. "No, that's too tiring. I have to be considerate," he said. Considerate? He expected me to put up with his parents every weekend, but the moment I suggested inviting mine, it was suddenly too much for him to handle. I realized then that Richard would never prioritize me over his parents. I was always going to come second. It was time to take action. I started planning another trip, but this time I had a different plan. I invited my father along, without telling Richard or his parents. My father used to manage a prestigious hotel, and I knew he would support me in standing up to them. When we arrived at the hotel, Richard and his parents were immediately dissatisfied. The food wasn't seasoned heavily enough for their liking, and they didn't hesitate to complain. What they didn't know was that my father was the one who had arranged everything. He had heard every complaint, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. Just as they were about to launch into another round of criticism, my father walked into the room. "I understand there have been some complaints," my father said calmly, but with authority. Richard and his parents froze. "If you're not satisfied, you're free to leave," he continued. "But know this, if you continue to mistreat my daughter, I will cut ties with you completely." Richard and his parents were stunned. They quickly tried to backtrack, but it was too late. My father had heard enough, and he wasn't going to let them bully me anymore. They left the hotel that night, tails between their legs. When we returned home, Richard tried to pretend like nothing had happened. But I had made up my mind. I wanted a divorce. I consulted a lawyer and filed the papers. When Richard